everyone. Welcome back to Tortoise's second annual climate conference. For those of you just joining us, I'm Giles Whittell, an editor here at Tortoise. I feel like I'm in a situation room, a bunker-like room deep beneath our headquarters in London. The question for this session is fixing West Virginia the secret to fighting climate change? Why is that the question? I have two answers. One is about politics and one is about fairness. The one about politics relates to my experiences outsiders to the United States of COP, to which the Biden White House sent a delegation, including the president, which hoped, as we understand it, to arrive with a massive climate bill signed, sealed, and delivered, but did not. And again, as we understood it as outsiders, because of the resistance from one particular senator, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who was in a position with a de facto veto in the Senate to prevent the climate bill passing, and it remains on the Senate floor. And so that is one very specific political reason why we're asking this question, but there's a broader one too that has to do with fairness, and it's more hypothetical. It goes like this: suppose that local, regional, and federal governments in the US could come up with a solution to the problem of West Virginia's resistance to transitioning from dependence on coal extraction to being another form of energy producer. Would we produce a model of fairness that could be rolled out elsewhere in the world where there are similar tensions between local communities and planetary imperatives? And so that is why, even if it seems condescending even from this distance to be addressing West Virginia so specifically, that's why we're doing it. We are very lucky to be joined from West Virginia by Professor James Van Nostrand, professor of and director of the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development at West Virginia University College of Law, and by Evan Hansen, a Democratic member of the West Virginia House of Delegates, and a scientist and a sustainable energy expert, and I think possibly entrepreneur as well in your own right. Thank you both very much for joining us. Professor Nostrand, perhaps I could start with you, and if you don't mind, I'm going to quote to you something that you were quoted as saying in a piece on CNBC. For a long time, you were quoted as saying, "The culture here in West Virginia has been, quote, what's good for coal is good for West Virginia," unquote. But that hasn't been true for 10 years or decades longer. So if it is no longer true, what has changed? And perhaps you could take that as a general invitation to set the context for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Giles, and thanks for allowing me this opportunity. It's a pleasure to join you. I've been in West Virginia for 11 years. I moved from New York, where I headed up an environmental NGO in New York. And so I'm most familiar with the last 10 or 11 years. And I think one of the things that's changed over that period of time is coal ceases to be a cost-effective way to generate electricity. You know, and as recently as 2008, West Virginia had the lowest electricity rates in the country. And then a lot of things have changed since then. We have the natural gas, the ability to extract natural gas from shale, which was really a game changer in terms of how we generate electricity. And then more recently, wind and solar have become cost competitive to now where utilities find it's cheaper to build new wind and solar than to run existing coal plants. And so, I mean, apart from the environmental impacts of burning coal, which relates to is coal good for West Virginia? I mean, over the last decade or so, it's just been expensive. Our electricity rates between 2008 and 2020 have gone up at 5 times the national average, because we haven't diversified away from coal. We've doubled down on coal during that period. So I look at it just as a matter of economics. And of course, we can talk about the environmental impacts of mountaintop removal and all of the acid mine drainage and the water pollution and the horrible environmental impacts associated with coal. But I approach it just from an economics perspective. Our electricity rates are continuing to go up very rapidly because we're not moving away from coal and taking advantage of lower cost resources.
Which prompts me to ask two quick follow-ups. One, just on a point of detail. From where I'm sitting, we're not used to energy markets that are so localized. I thought there was a national grid in the US as well. How is it that your power rates can be so very different from your neighbors?
It's at the retail level, our rates are regulated by the state regulator, the Public Service Commission. In this part of the country, we're served by PJM, which is the wholesale power market serving 13 states in the Mid-Atlantic region. So you can see what the prevailing wholesale prices are, and gives you an idea of coal has really been pushed out on the dispatch curve in terms of when they dispatch resources from lowest cost to highest cost. The coal plants are often out of the money, and our utilities, because we still have as of 2020, 88% of the electricity generated in West Virginia is still coming from coal, and so we haven't diversified into cheaper natural gas and wind and solar. The availability of those resources from the market, it's there because it's a very competitive wholesale market, PJM, and then we have the Mid-Continent ISO, we have New England ISO, the New York ISO, and the California ISO. So, and in Texas, ERCOT. So we have competitive wholesale markets throughout the country. So the cheaper price resources are there. We're currently having a battle in front of the retail regulator in West Virginia, the Public Service Commission, which is telling the utilities, notwithstanding the availability of lower cost resources, we want you to continue burning coal and keep those plants operating at historical levels rather than where economics would dictate. And that in and of itself is going to cause a pretty significant increase in prices for West Virginia ratepayers.
So why is that? And why more generally have West Virginians as voters and their representatives in Congress not responded in a more logical way to everything that you have just described, the falling cost of energy from gas and wind and solar relative to coal?
Well, we have a governor who's a coal baron. His motto when he ran for re-election in 2020 was Jim Justice, he never gave up on coal. And we have outsized influence of the West Virginia Coal Association. The former president of the West Virginia Coal Association is now a member of the 3 members of the West Virginia Public Service Commission, which regulates rates. The chair of that commission is a former lobbyist for the coal, oil, and gas industry, who received substantial campaign contributions whenever she's run from office from the utilities and the coal, oil, and gas operators. And we just have a commission that's completely captive to the coal industry. And I've written pieces, the goal of the Public Service Commission these days seems to be to bail out the coal industry on the backs of the West Virginia ratepayers. And we're trying to get the word out in terms of that's why electricity rates have gone up at 5 times the national average over the last dozen or so years, is coal is not a cost-effective way to generate electricity. It's time to start moving away from it. But with the failed political leadership that we currently have in West Virginia, that's not happening, and our ratepayers are paying the consequences for it.
American consumers and voters are pretty famous for taking a clear-eyed, pocketbook-based view of these kinds of issues. Is this in fact a local cultural question in which local cultural issues are overriding those pocketbook issues, or is it about jobs as well? I mean, we saw in one of the slides that the number of people directly employed by the coal industry in West Virginia has fallen significantly, but have other sectors stepped in to pick up the shortfall?
No, I think our employment prospects we still have a relatively high unemployment rates in West Virginia, and the number of coal miners, I think, is below 13,000 now in West Virginia. It's very much a cultural issue. I mean, I learned that when I came to the state in 2011. It's a source of great pride when you look at the role that Appalachian coal played in the industrialization of the United States. It's literally, we industrialized the United States on the backs of West Virginia coal miners and more broadly Appalachian coal miners. And it's a source of great pride. Lots of families in the state. My father was a coal miner. My grandfather was a coal miner. My uncle was a coal miner. Kids can go into the coal mines right out of high school and make $85,000 a year. But then there's been a lot of very creative and effective public relations campaigns done by the West Virginia Coal Association. You know, the Friends of Coal, it's everywhere. And so it was a very conscious effort to, pejoratively, is to brainwash a generation of how important coal is to West Virginia. And so it's effective, but and that's really a cultural issue. And then on feeding on that, I think you have politicians who would rather tell the West Virginia citizens what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And they like to hear somebody like Donald Trump coming in to say, the coal miners, your jobs are coming back. Jim Justice saying, I never gave up on coal, which really interferes with the ability to talk about a transition and to basically plan for a transition. When you have your political leaders saying we don't need a transition, the coal jobs are coming back. I think it's shameful, frankly, but that's the situation we have in West Virginia. And Joe Manchin's played a pretty significant role himself in stopping the clean energy transition that could have happened with the bipartisan infrastructure package, the reconciliation package, the clean electricity performance program, which could have provided vast subsidies to the West Virginia utilities to start to diversify away from coal. But that's not where he gets his political contributions from. And so that's never going to happen. The $550 billion in the $1.7 trillion Build Back Better program directed towards clean energy, that's just not going to happen. And West Virginia ratepayers are going to bear a disproportionate share of the consequences of that.
Thank you so much. I was going to invite you, Evan Hansen, to talk about the Manchin part, and I will, because we've had a very illuminating kind of introduction to the more local and regional figures involved. But do we have it right, looking at this story from outside, that on the national level, it is this one senator from West Virginia who has held up passage of what could have been a $500 billion climate package, which really would have turned the corner away from the denialism of the Trump years?
Well, I think that's essentially right. There were really two senators, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema from Arizona, who were holdouts. But I think if Manchin was fully in support of those measures, they could have gotten it done.
That's extraordinary. And I want to come, in a sense, to the what we decided with James was a cultural question, the extent to which Manchin does or does not represent the state. I read a few weeks ago that a coal union leader had actually broken ranks, you might put it, to make the argument to Manchin that if he unbent a little bit and helped the administration in Washington get this package through, it might eventually be better for his constituents, Manchin's constituents, and this union guy's members. But is that the exception that proves the rule? Does Manchin have a pretty good read on what his voters think?
Well, I think there are a number of people who have been trying to influence Manchin over the last year or so. I'd like to joke that that's been like the biggest growth industry in West Virginia, has been all this money pumped into the state to influence Joe Manchin. Does he have the pulse of the voters? He's very popular among the Republicans in the state of West Virginia, even though he's a Democrat. But I also think that that's not the whole story, in the sense that one role that politicians have is not necessarily to do what the polls say, but to help move the polls if it's something that's important for the country and something that's important for the state. And I think Joe Manchin is in a very unique role on this issue and energy issues in general, that if he is willing to take that on and to shape a reconciliation bill that can work for West Virginia and bring a lot of investments here, that could help move the polls and help us move into a new place. So I think that's been a missed opportunity.
Right. So let me be clear. Are you saying he's making efforts at reconciliation that you support?
No, I'm saying that he has the opportunity to,
Right.
and he still can. And I think that if he were to do that, and if he were to sell it to West Virginians, I think he's a respected voice on energy issues in West Virginia. And I think people would listen to what he has to say, and he could bring people along. He could be the truth teller that Jamie's talking about, not just say we're going to protect the industry that's been so good to West Virginia for generations, but talk about what it's going to require for West Virginia to succeed in the new economy.
Tell us a little bit more about the political culture in which you operate in the, and I need to get the phraseology right, it's called the House of Delegates rather than the State Assembly, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. In the legislature, we have the state Senate and then the House
Yeah.
of Delegates.
Because I read, and I want you to tell this story rather than me trying to tell it for you, just by, you said an extraordinary thing about the first time that you uttered the words climate change on the floor of the House.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but I've made it a point since I've been in office for the last 4 sessions to try to normalize the conversation about climate change and actually talk about it on the House floor and in committees. I serve on the House Energy and Manufacturing Committee. It really hasn't been part of the debate, and so many of the bills that we vote on have very clear climate implications. For example, whether or not to bail out a coal-fired power plant by spending millions of dollars, or whether or not to reduce the tax on coal that's mined. Things like that are being decided without even any acknowledgement that they have an impact on climate, or that West Virginia should even consider climate. And one of the things that became clear very soon, talking about issues like that, goes back to what Professor Van Nostrand said about the cultural issue. I can't tell you how many delegates got up to speak and talked about how their father was a coal miner, or their grandfather was a coal miner. I mean, this is real. And this is people's actual experience here. And people from outside West Virginia, it might sound strange, but it's actually real. And that's one reason why I think a transition is happening in West Virginia. And we've passed several good bills over the last several years that I could talk about, but I think it's going to be a gradual process. And it's really a generational shift. It's not something that can just change in a small number of years.
Well, I would like you to tell us about those bills, because perhaps that is the kind of detail that we need to understand if we're looking for a model for a just transition. But I will read out to you what I read. You were quoted as saying, when I mentioned the phrase climate change during a House floor debate to reduce coal tax reductions, I was told it was the first time the phrase was mentioned during a floor debate in people's memories, which suggests a state closed off from the rest of the world, a bit like some of the stories you heard about parts of the Soviet Union in the 1950s that weren't aware that the Second World War had happened. I mean, that is quite extraordinary to hear from an outsider, for an outsider.
Yeah, it is extraordinary, and that's what I've been told, and that's why I think it's important to, talk about it every session, find a few bills to speak about it on, and propose bills as well that will help address climate change in ways that work for West Virginia.
So, what are the measures before the House that it could vote on that might move things along?
Well, in the 2020 session, we passed 2 good solar bills. One of them allows each of the major electric utilities to develop, by West Virginia standards, a large amount of utility scale solar. And we have 2 major electric utilities in the state, and both of them are moving forward with their first large scale utility solar projects that they'll be offering to their customers that have corporate sustainability goals or other reasons for wanting renewable energy. And then the other bill we passed in 2020 removed what was a punitive tax on large-scale solar arrays that would sell into the wholesale market. And that spurred a large amount of independent power producers to come to West Virginia. And so when we passed those bills, there was only 10 megawatts of solar in the entire state. And now if you look at the queue, this is the solar projects that are working on getting interconnection agreements with the local grid. That's up over 4,000 megawatts. So, that's been quite a remarkable increase.
And why do you need to pass a law to allow utilities to develop utility scale solar if it is already cheaper to install than adding coal capacity?
Because the politics are such, as Professor Van Nostrand mentioned about who's on the Public Service Commission, and the Public Service Commission regulates these utilities and says yes or no when they want to put new resources online. And they without legislation saying that it is the public policy of the state of West Virginia that we need more renewable resources because that's going to help us attract jobs and businesses to site here that will only come here if they have access to enough renewables. Without putting that into state code as the policy of West Virginia, unfortunately, the Public Service Commission will shoot down the utilities' requests for recovering their costs for renewable energy projects.
I read also about a measure to allow the retail sale, of solar, so long as it was installed on former coal mine land. Has that gone through, and why restrict it to former coal mines, if so?
Well, the utility solar bill that I mentioned a minute ago, that does restrict it to former coal mines or other degraded sites.
Right.
Now, I had proposed my own bill before the utility solar bill ended up passing, which was essentially a compromise after mine. And my bill would have also limited it to former coal mines. And the reason, there's two reasons. One is that for states like neighboring Virginia, where they're having a massive amount of solar development, they're seeing a lot of undeveloped sites turn into solar arrays, and it's creating some issues in terms of essentially, paving over with solar panels, lots of farmland and things like that. So I just think it's good public policy to put solar panels on sites that are degraded and don't necessarily have other good uses. But number two, I think politically it's helpful to do that because this will be a way to direct these investments into communities that are impacted by the decline of the coal industry, because that's where these coal mine sites are, and to help create jobs and revenues for those local communities. So I think politically it's a good move as well.
Okay. In a minute, I'd like to come to Theodore Harris if he's interested in speaking, because you make an interesting point about global demand for coal in light of current tragic circumstances. And if you'd like to, you've made it in the chat, if you'd like to make it verbally, please do. But first, I want to ask Professor Van Nostrand, about another way in which West Virginia is seeking to have an impact on federal US climate policy, which is this lawsuit against, well, it's a leading plaintiff, as I understand it, in a lawsuit against the Environmental Protection Agency. Can you tell us what that would do and give us your read on what the Supreme Court might do with it?
Yeah, certainly. That the lawsuit is West Virginia versus EPA. It relates to what authority the Environmental Protection Agency has to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. And ever since Obama was president and proposed the Clean Power Plan, and Evan and I worked closely on modeling that for West Virginia, what that impact would have been. Our Attorney General in West Virginia, Patrick Morrissey, has been very effective at organizing pretty much all the coal states in challenging everything that the Environmental Protection Agency was doing during the Obama administration, So there was an initial case, West Virginia versus EPA, that challenged the Clean Power Plan.
Mhm.
And then when Trump became president, they moved away from the Clean Power Plan and adopted an Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which got reversed by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And that's what's on appeal to the US Supreme Court. And, but the case is postured. There's a lot of politics going on with the US Supreme Court these days, and the question of what is the power of regulatory agencies. And so the timing is such that the Supreme Court is taking up this case because it presents an opportunity to drastically reduce the authority of government agencies to act in a comprehensive manner without clear statutory authority. And the fear of the environmental community is that the outcome of the West Virginia versus EPA case will be to drastically restrict the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate greenhouse gases in a rigorous manner without clear statutory authority. It's at the same time, what I've written is because of economics, and this is where the public relations piece comes into play, because Attorney General Morrissey is projecting himself as this big defender of the coal industry, and this is the biggest environmental case of the decade. But it won't make any difference whatsoever, even if they get the relief that they want and the EPA authority to regulate greenhouse gases is drastically reduced, because based on economics, no one's going to build a new coal plant. It just doesn't matter. But that doesn't stop Morrissey from really promoting his efforts on behalf of the coal industry. This is a big game changer. It will be harmful in terms of taking away some of the tools that the EPA might have to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, because frankly, it's hard to get any environmental legislation through Congress. And that's what we learned when Obama was president, is you can't get the legislation passed through Congress. You're going to use whatever statutory authority you currently have under the Clean Air Act, which is how we got to the Clean Power Plan. So it could have that impact of reducing the EPA's authority in terms of what it actually does to improve the prospects for the coal industry. Virtually nothing.
It's completely fascinating. Again, when you consider the primacy of economics in most high-level American decision-making, which is why I wanted to come. Theo Harris, are you interested in making this point about global coal demand?
Hi, yeah, sorry, it's Duncan. I'm on my little brother's.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead. Say what you wanted to say.
Yes, so the couple points which came up for me was that because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously it's had a massive effect on all global commodities, but over recent years, as European coal mines particularly have wound down without a decrease in demand for steel products, say, almost all of which are still heavily reliant on coal, we've been increasingly reliant on Russian coal. If there are suddenly wide-reaching bans on Russian coal, particularly to Europe, but also across the rest of the world, suddenly the world is short a lot of coal. We're seeing, therefore, the coal price, go ridiculously high, quadruple, quintuple, and this suddenly goes straight back across to America, who see actually we're ones who still have viable open working mines. At this price, it's very economically attractive for us to keep mining the coal. So in terms of the impacts for West Virginia, the two thoughts I'd had were, one, well, this prolongs mine life potentially considerably if over the next 10 years, as we take Russian coal out of the mix, where's the coal going to come from for all of this existing steel demand, among other, still thermal coal demand as well. Secondly, is this going to have a bad effect, even more so, on West Virginia ratepayers if they are so reliant on coal power within the state because of all of the political things we've discussed previously? Then is that coal price reflected going to be really terrible for the consumers, the ratepayers? And then the other point I made, if I could just add one more, was that I'm actually working with a group who are putting renewable energy on former coal mine lands in West Virginia. And on the coal mine lands, I completely agree with everything that's been said. It's a great use for degraded former land. But actually the main holdup for that process is the PJM approval process, which is currently it's a sort of 5 to 7 year wait on if you submit a project now on a piece of land which is ready to stick solar panels on, you're not going to get that approved for interconnection into the grid for 7 years. And if that's just a massive headache. That's a real disincentive to get anything done, and that's a real issue.
Thanks so much. Evan, let's come to you. Maybe you can tell us what the PJM approval process is, and what is your take on the effect of the war on global coal prices, and whether that's going to give a new lease on life to West Virginia coal?
Yeah, so PJM, again, that's the regional grid that serves West Virginia
right.
and about a dozen other states. And that's exactly true. The issue is that you can't just hook up a generating station into the grid. There's a process. And that process was set up over the years to handle a small number of relatively large generators, like a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas power plant. But what's happened in the last few years, because of the dramatic increase in solar development across the entire region, not just West Virginia, is that there's, I believe, thousands of projects now that have been submitted to interconnect to the grid. And the PJM approval process essentially broke down. It couldn't handle that number of approvals. So there's been a moratorium placed on it, and they're coming out with a new process sometime later this year that hopefully should be in place by maybe the end of the year or so. But then they've got this backlog of thousands of projects. So that's having a real impact. And just speaking from the point of view of West Virginia, it's been a real shame because we finally passed those reasonably good laws in 2020. There's action now in West Virginia, but those projects are not going to be built for many years through no fault of us as West Virginia policymakers. And that's going to make it more challenging for us as policymakers to point to these successes and build on the successes, because the projects aren't going to be built, the workers aren't going to be hired, the payments aren't going to be made to the local Board of Education or the local county commission. So it's a challenge, but it's not something that we could control. In terms of the opportunities to export West Virginia coal, that was actually exactly the subject of the Energy Committee meeting that was held just a few weeks ago, looking at opportunities for coal and natural gas, given the Ukraine situation. And in terms of coal, what we heard from the Coal Association is there's no extra capacity right now. So many coal mines have shut down, and the coal that's being mined right now is already under contract into the future. That they can't, and they have issues with workforce. They just can't hire people to increase the amount of coal being mined. So they can't just like turn a dial and start chipping more coal in Europe. It's not quite that simple, at least for steam coal. Now for met coal that's used to produce steel, there's a lot of met coal that's being exported from West Virginia, and there are opportunities to export more met coal. But that's typically not the type of coal that's used to generate electricity.
Thank you. In the time remaining, I want to ask both of you, and keep going in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye to see if what ideas other people have. How this nut might be cracked. James, I've scribbled a question to myself. What would solve the Manchin problem? What would unblock Manchin? Is it ironically an ambitious carbon plan of precisely the kind that he is blocking in the Senate? In that might be the kind of plan to deliver the jobs that would satisfy his constituents, or if not, then what would persuade him to be the truth teller that both of you kind of have invited him to be?
Well, there's a lot of speculation, over the last period since he's been chair of the Senate Energy Committee, and literally probably the second most powerful person in Washington, in terms of what motivates him, what's going to make a difference. It's hard to say. It's in many respects, I find what his actions have been in that role, and as Delegate Hansen mentioned, a missed opportunity in terms of the benefits that could have been delivered to West Virginia. I mean, I look at it as he is not really acting in the best interests of West Virginians. He's protecting the interests of the fossil fuel industry, frankly, and he's got personal financial investment in the fossil fuel industry in terms of a waste coal plant here in West Virginia. He regularly talks with utility executives, and so when he uses words like, "Well, what's the sense of urgency, and why would we pay the utilities to do what they're already doing?" Those are sound bites that that he gets from utility executives, and so he doesn't listen, to the environmental organizations. There is a sense of urgency. Just look at the IPCC reports, right? There should be a sense of urgency, and look at the benefits that we could have had in West Virginia had you not blocked the $555 billion in the Build Back Better program. As Delegate Hansen mentioned, that it's like a full employment industry in West Virginia is trying to figure out how to influence Senator Manchin and how to figure out how he thinks and what's going to work. And everybody's scratching their heads. It's been extremely frustrating. I don't know what will work. I think, to his credit, I think with inflation now being a major issue, he's now looking, he looks more favorable in terms of, we started out with a $6 trillion budget reconciliation package, which he says is never going to pass. And I think, with it, and so he's looking pretty good in terms of that inflation point now. And the question is, can you even justify a scaled down version? But I think in all honesty, when you look at the elements, the clean energy elements of that program, it would help deal with inflation because frankly, wind and solar are a cheaper way to generate electricity, and the infrastructure and promoting electric vehicles, which gets us off fossil fuels and gasoline. It's a whole bunch of things that would work out in terms of national security and resilience of the grid and resilience of our economy to avoid the volatility of fossil fuel price changes. But it's been very frustrating in terms of looking how much West Virginia needs, how much we would benefit from this massive amount of federal spending that could have happened, and the fact that he has really stood in the way of making that happen.
How much outright climate denialism, rejection of the science that underpins it, do you encounter living there? We saw on one of the slides at the top of the session, kind of a dark patch where West Virginia is. Someone's come up with a metric for climate denial. Do you encounter active resistance to the science that's out there in your daily life?
I've encountered some. I've been pleasantly surprised with the students at the law school, even some who come from coal families. They don't debate the science anymore. I think they're frustrated that in many respects, I think the population might be ready to move on this more quickly than the political leaders who are holding us back. But I know I'm sure I'm just seeing a very small cross section of the folks in West Virginia. But I certainly don't see it on a daily basis with the law students with whom I work.
Well, one would certainly expect law students, they're perhaps not representative of the population at large, but that is at least something to cling on to. Evan, let me come back to you. Are we right looking at this as a big issue, as a case study within a big issue, to focus on West Virginia, or is it likely that because of the big economic trends that you and James have been talking about, the rest of the country will move on? But even as I say that, there's another question: can the country move on as long as a senator from West Virginia is blocking that movement?
I think the country can move on because, we have a very complicated political system here. And while it would be ideal if there was a bold federal policy on climate change, that's what I think would be really helpful. Absent that, different states are moving at different paces. Different counties and cities are moving along at different paces. And on top of that, so much of this is being driven by the private sector. large and small corporations that demand renewables, and it's forcing cities and counties and states to take action. So, I think it's a huge missed opportunity, but I think it just means that those of us in state legislatures and, mayors and county commissioners need to do as much as we can at the local level.
Coming back to the question that we've posed for this whole series of sessions that we're having today, how important in the transition, slow as it is in West Virginia, that you are a part of, how important is fairness among voters, and how important is the perception of fairness, and are they different things?
Yeah, well, that's been a huge issue. And, when I first ran for office, I was told, like, you can't use the word transition. Nobody could ever get elected if they used the word transition, energy transition. But I didn't follow that advice and I got elected. And I've worked on that issue a lot, proposing bills related to just transition policies. And we actually got some movement on that in the last couple of years. There's now a select committee on coalfield communities that was established last year. And we did a set of listening sessions in 5 of the coal communities across West Virginia, wrote a report on what it would take to diversify coal communities and what types of policies and investments would be required, and actually passed some bills related to that. And, with a lot of input from coal miners and local officials and others. And so I think that's absolutely necessary. In order to be taken seriously on addressing climate and this whole energy transition issue, you gotta be cognizant of the people in the communities that have been reliant on coal for decades. And it is just not the people, it is the communities. There are local towns that are entirely dependent on the coal industry, not just in terms of the other businesses in town, but the money paid into the school systems or the local county commission funds and things like that. I mean, these are real issues. They can be addressed by policy in terms of helping to cushion the blow, but they're real issues.
Right, but is it plausible to go to these communities as a local or regional politician and say, we're not just going to cushion the blow, we're going to replace the jobs, we're going to replace all the support that you've had over the decades and centuries from coal with exactly equivalent, if not more, from a new energy industry called wind and solar? Does that not happen, and does it not get traction?
Well, the problem is it's not that simple. I mean, I wish we could say that we're going to replace jobs one for one with wind and solar, but they're different in some ways. Coal industry jobs continue over the long term as a coal mine is open. But typically there's way fewer long-term jobs with renewables. You've got the jobs related to installing the renewables, but then once a solar field is in place, there's very few jobs related to the operation and maintenance of those. And that's just the reality. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't create so many solar and wind construction jobs over the next decade that we could actually match the number of coal mining jobs that are lost. And then we'll worry about that 10 years from now and see where we are. Fossil fuel advocates use that argument for pipeline construction, for example. They like to count the pipeline construction jobs, even though those are temporary construction jobs. So it's only fair to count the temporary construction jobs for renewables as well. But it's not quite as simple as saying we could come in here and replace the jobs. And so that's why these listening sessions, this is the type of approach that I think is needed. There's resources that are available, but we need to say, what do you want? What's unique about your local community? What are the opportunities to build upon your workforce and the natural assets in your region, the current businesses that are there? How could we do something unique that's going to work for your town and for your county? And that's the approach. I think that's the only approach that'll work.
Okay. Well, Sarah is asking in the chat, if not one-to-one in terms of job replacement, what is the ratio? Do you have any kind of a figure for that?
I don't have a figure for that, but I know that if you look at other states that have embraced renewables, it's not unreasonable to think that we could have many thousands of workers across West Virginia in the wind and solar industry, maybe 5 to 10,000. And, Jamie mentioned 13,000 coal miners, and there's going to continue to be coal mined in West Virginia, for many years, even if there's an aggressive transition to renewables. So the amount of jobs we could create in the renewable industry may not exactly equal what's in the coal industry, but it would be a substantial portion of those jobs.
Thanks. I want to come back to James in a second to give him the last word, but could we just try a brief zoom to Ireland? Alexander McMaster, are you there? Are you still with us? I can see you are, actually. You made an interesting point about Ireland. Are there lessons for us?
Yeah, I think so. There's Ireland hasn't had a coal industry like we're talking about here, but what we have had is peat extraction. And peat extraction is something that is based on a traditional form of fuel. So for generations and generations, people have been cutting peat to fuel their houses. Each house in Ireland traditionally would have been associated with a piece of land which was available for fuel for peat extraction. Now that was industrialized after Ireland became a republic in the 20th century, and that was a major industry in the Midlands of Ireland. So in transitioning away from that, one challenge that has been faced is that people are so deeply rooted in this industry that it's something that you can't just simply approach and say, even if new jobs are provided one for one, it's moving away from something that is really culturally significant as well. So while I haven't been part of the work myself, there is an organization, the Community Wetlands Forum has been working in the Midlands in Ireland and has been working with those communities to kind of demonstrate, first of all, there is value in what you've done. You essentially built up the Irish state from very little, and now we're going to assist you in moving towards jobs in solar and in wind. And the government did set up, I'm afraid I won't be able to go into this. I don't know the specifics of it well enough to be able to kind of quote me on it, but the government did set up a Just Transition Fund, which was aimed at, and I could pull up the figure somewhere, did put in place a Just Transition Fund in order to help transition that industry and to provide the training for workers to transition into other forms of energy, so solar and wind.
Thanks very much. So obviously to that extent, these lessons are transferable, or perhaps they are. Professor Nostrand, let me come back to you finally on this question of fairness and whether that is a central component in the transition to get right. And let me just add a twist. There is no Putin-style censorship in the US of media, far from it. Everybody knows, don't they, that Manchin has commercial coal interests. Why is his position in this debate not widely perceived as unfair? Well, not more widely perceived as unfair.
I mean, there's certainly been a number of articles written about it. Washington Post, New York Times. Yeah. I mean, Politico. I mean, E&E. It's well known, and he's not breaking any laws. He's not breaking any Senate ethic rules. I think it is unfair, but it's where we are. He's literally the only Democrat who could get elected in West Virginia, and it's easy to talk about replacing him, but it's like it would be with a Republican, and it could be worse. So it is what it is. And it's really there's been enough written about it. It doesn't seem to be moving the needle with respect to how he approaches these issues at all. On the broader issue of fairness, I think that is a huge deal in terms of this is a major transformation in the energy industry, and it displaces fossil fuel workers throughout the country if we really decarbonize like we need to in order to address climate change. And it's such a widespread issue that it is a role where you expect the federal government to provide, the funds, right? But it's going back to what Delegate Hansen said. You need to talk to the communities to figure out what those just transition programs look like. What are the elements in terms of coal plant closes down? You've got a community that's going to lose the property tax revenues. You've got the coal plant employees who lose their jobs and need to be retrained. You got the coal workers, the miners who lose their jobs and need to be retrained. What does that all look like? How does it fit together? And where does the money come from? But this is a fundamental transformation that we need. There needs to be a role for the government in managing that transition to make sure it's fair. And there's union issues obviously involved, and the fossil fuel workers make pretty good money, right? And so it's sort of addressing the one-to-one thing in terms of, well, energy efficiency and renewable jobs don't pay as well as the fossil fuel jobs. And so we try to figure out how we can make the economics work, because I think we have to present the complete, comprehensive package in terms of how all this fits together in order to advance the discussion on what this just transition would look like.
Thank you so much, James Nostrand, Evan Hansen, and everybody else. I've started this session with the zeal of someone who's read a bit about it and couldn't understand why what seemed to be arithmetic solutions were not more easily applied. But what I feel I've learned is that these issues are real. They're not black and white. They're cultural. And you, just to repeat what was just said, if you want to find a solution for a community, you need to talk to the community. It is now 22 minutes past 5 in London. Thanks again, gentlemen, both of you, for joining us from West Virginia. Thanks to everybody else for pitching in. The next and final session in the summit happens at 6:30, so in an hour and 8 minutes. It is with Jeevan addressing the question, should we stop flying? So you've got time for a little more than a cup of tea. Please enjoy it and join us back in the room, as it were, at 6:30. Thanks again very much.